Understanding the cause of pain and suffering to a large extent determines how we respond to that pain and suffering in our lives. One way suggested by Dostoevsky is to simply accept it as a fact of life. And in this regard, he says, pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. We really great men must, I think, have really great sadness on earth. And then another way that humans respond to this pain and suffering in their lives is simply to harden their hearts against our God. And an interesting quote by Teresa Avila, which is the Spanish nun and mystic, she said, if this is the way you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few of them. So my experience tells me that there's another way, and maybe this comes from my own personal experience, to react to pain and suffering, and that's basically to withdraw from any opportunity to get hurt. And Pope Benedict XVI says in this regard, a really interesting quote here, it's when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, that we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaningless and abandonment is all the greater. So here's my question. We'll try to wrap this up. It's sort of like a two-part question. What is the Christian perspective on how to respond to pain and suffering? And maybe sort of a related question is, we all suffer, people from all faiths or no faith suffer, and Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, we all suffer. Sometimes I view people from other religions, particularly Hindus, actually dealing with pain and suffering in their lives a lot better than we Christians, who tend to sort of cry out about it. So my answer to you is, what is it about the Christian faith that brings sort of meaning to our suffering?
Well, the reactions that you've mentioned are all perfectly understandable to me. The idea, Dostoevsky's point, that suffering is involved in producing character is absolutely right to a point. Because when the suffering becomes extreme, it's obvious it's not producing anything more. When it becomes meaningless and so on. So I think he's right to a certain extent. Just as in another sphere, I know people are very keen on sport here, and you'll see people absolutely pushing their bodies to the limit of pain and endurance to get that body tone so they'd be a big football player. So that kind of suffering is understandable because they've got a purpose for doing it. It's when any possible purpose appears to be frustrated that it becomes very difficult. Withdrawing is very understandable, and I think there is a sense often when people have pain, they need to withdraw for a time. I mean, my sister lost her daughter at 22, just married with a brain tumour. She hasn't lost her Christian faith, but she had to withdraw for a time. She just couldn't cope with it. And that's a very understandable reaction. I think we have to be very generous and broad in our understanding. And I think too, I'm glad you mentioned people from other faiths or none, because sometimes even my atheist friends have learned more about la condition humaine and facing suffering, that they come out with a better reaction than some of us who are afraid of going to the dentist, if you see what I mean. And I think we need to absolutely respect that. You see, from where I sit, I would expect that to happen. That often we're shown up by people who have other worldviews for the simple reason that, as a Christian, I regard every man and woman as made in the image of God, whether they believe in Him or not. And therefore they're moral beings, and therefore they're capable of moral responses, and therefore I can learn from them. In fact, it's that facilitates my debates and discussions around the world, because as far as being made in the image of God is concerned, all of us are equal. Now, what does the Christian faith specifically add? I think that's what you're driving at. Well, the bottom line for me is this, that we can do all we can and we need to alleviate suffering in this world and help the victims. But the fact is, suffering in the Philippines has led to the death of thousands of people. Babies, innocent people, and so on. And before I'm finished this talk, this discussion with you tonight, I don't know how many thousand innocent children will have died. So, If atheism is the right reaction to it, I say yes, it's an understandable reaction. But does it solve anything? It means you have to regard the universe just that's how it is, and you have to just accept it as a brute fact. But there's another thing, it doesn't remove the suffering. And from where I sit, it can make it worse, because if death is the end, and of course here comes an absolutely central Christian belief that because of the resurrection of Jesus, the world begins to look different because death is not the end. There arises then the possibility, and for my understanding, the certainty, not simply the possibility, that God is going to put things right in an utterly fair way that it will be seen to be fair. And atheism removes that completely. So it's that hope, ultimately, that I would have to factor into this equation. Does that go far enough, do you think, or do you want to probe a little bit further?
I think maybe you could speak on, you were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that there's a certain amount of pain that makes sense, but there's pain that is extreme, like in the Philippines. Yeah. One wants to ask the question, what was the reason for that? What's gained by that?
Well, in a sense, I find that impossible to answer. I think, let me put it this way, we haven't yet seen the entire story. And I think there is a day in which we will see the entire story. And when we've seen the whole picture, we might understand something of it. But I'm not sure that all suffering has a purpose in that sense. Because that would mean that evil, malevolent evil, has a purpose. And to come to some of my Jewish friends who've lost all their relatives in the Holocaust and said, by the way, your parents being gassed at Auschwitz has a purpose, would be to insult them and mock them. I think we need to get away of the idea that we can find a purpose of it all. Going back to what's called the free will defense, this universe is a fractured world, and people are fractured beings. They have the capacity to do evil, and that has consequences. Lewis makes the point, and I think he's right, that if God had made a world where if I lift a big stick to hit you, it suddenly becomes rubber, and it doesn't harm you. But if I use it to build a house, it will remain stable. That is again, he argues, that is again to remove free will completely. And it's the consequence of free will, for instance, Hitler's abuse of it, that leads to that. Now, I have to ask the question, since I can't assign a purpose to it for those individuals, I come back to the fact that, do I believe in a God that's going to be big enough and capable to do something about that, so that I can in the end look at what he does and say that's right? And I've come to the conclusion that that's the only solution. Otherwise, atheism is the name of the game. But the suffering's still there. And it doesn't have any purpose in suffering at all, of course.
Well, John, let's move on. Let me ask you my second question. And it also relates to this sort of pain and suffering and sources of pain and suffering. In your talk, you mentioned suffering that results from natural causes.
Yes.
And you also mentioned suffering that comes from moral causes. So I want to address another source of pain and suffering, and that is mental suffering. Sure. In the form of sort of depression and anxiety.
Yes, sure.
And depression is just a debilitating condition, and it affects not only the individual but all of those around the individual that love them and support them. In fact, statistics from the Center of Disease Control here in the United States estimates that 21 million people each year suffer from depression. And just to refer back to C.S. Lewis that you used a quote, he has a wonderful quote from his book, The Problem of Pain, that says, "Mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, and it's more common and also harder to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases its burden." And just to refer here, here at Cornell over the last several years, we've had just the tragic suicides of several students, as many other universities have experienced. And so this is my question for you. Where does mental pain and suffering originate, and what role does God play in that process?
All of us suffer at times from various degrees of depression. That's very clear, and it's very sad when people don't realize that this is a very deep and painful sort of suffering. I'm actually the kind of chaplain at my college, so I get talking to students who are in this state, and I'm very well aware of the suicidal tendencies that are absolutely tragic. Where does it come from? Well, of course, it can come from many sources. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but I work with a lot of medical doctors. It can come from the imbalance of chemicals in the brain, and that is often treatable very successfully. But it can come from wrong decisions. It can come from decisions we make, maybe in good faith, and suddenly our world crumbles because of those decisions, and we can see no way out. So it seems to me there are huge amounts, very varied sources. Now, the question is, or one of the questions that I have asked myself, you see, if you go back to Richard Dawkins, he's written a book called The God Delusion, that God is a delusion. Now, delusion is a psychiatric term. And there's been a very interesting book written recently by the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the past president in Britain, on is faith a delusion? And he makes this very interesting point. He says there's a meta-study, that is a study of studies, has been done on the relationship between, amongst other things, religious belief and depression. And he says the results have been kept essentially secret. He calls it the best kept secret of psychiatry, that faith in God makes a significant difference. Now, this is many epidemiological studies that say if you look at depression, if you look at substance abuse, if you look at marital happiness, if you look at tendency to suicide, all of those are significantly diminished by faith in God. Now, I find this very interesting, and he points this out. He said if the results of this study had gone in the opposite direction, it would be headline news throughout the world. But because it has favoured religious belief, nobody knows about it, and it's a major report in the American Journal of Health. And it seems to be, therefore, in answer to your question, that a scientific analysis, whatever else we're going to say, all other things being equal, that belief in God and coping with depression are two things that are actually quite closely related. So I want to say that we can discuss the sources, and you need to be a medic and a psychiatrist and so on to all the sources, but when it comes to the alleviation of the problem, belief in God is, it would seem, the scientific evidence, and I emphasize that because Dawkins is claiming to be a scientist, and he calls it a delusion, which is a very dangerous thing to say to people for whom their faith in God is one of the biggest comforts they've got in their psychiatric depression.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. So I want to refer now back to a debate that you did, or a discussion that you did with atheist Gideon Rosen, which I'm assuming you remember, right?
I do.
He questioned your faith in God, and he asked the questions such as this: who lets these types of disasters happen? And he really questions loving and trusting a God who stands aside in the face of such devastating consequences. In fact, he maintains that the faith and worship of such a God is indicative of pathological thinking and belief. And during the debate that you had with him, he asked you the following question, and I'm really interested to hear your response to that same question tonight. How can any person love and trust a God who causes or allows such devastating pain and suffering? Doesn't this raise questions regarding the ethics of devotion for Christians?
Well, I would in part answer him now the way what I've just said. is that regarded as pathological doesn't stand up to the scientific evidence. It seems to be not pathological. And Andrew Sim's conclusion is precisely that. Precisely that. He mentions that thing. But I understand, of course, where Gideon Rosen is coming from. Now, this is actually a complex question, and I want to explain part of it, why it is. Take the earthquake in Christchurch. Now, I had to face it. I was flying out and the earthquake happens, and I had to change all my lectures and lectures on earthquake why, you see. And I had to think very carefully about that. Because here's the odd thing. If there were no tectonic plates, neither you or I would be alive. Because life, biological life of all kinds, is dependent on the shifting of those plates and the fact that they float on the surface of the magma in the earth. Now, that's a fascinating thing, and it leads to a very strange paradox, that here is a mechanism that is responsible for life, and yet it's killing. Now, why does it kill? The earthquakes aren't evil. If you build a house on top of a fault line, well, you may well be asking for trouble. And so the earthquake's doing its job of maintaining life, atmospheric balance, and so on the planet, and yet it's an agent of destruction. And that raises now the philosophical question instantly. Could God not make fire that doesn't burn but warms? Could he make electricity that isn't dangerous? And so on. And here we're back to the same thing. Now, I noticed Gideon Rosen was very careful in saying causes are allowed. Now, I would wipe out the word cause, because from where I sit, God doesn't cause evil, but the nature of the universe is that it's a possibility because of his gift of freedom. And I suspect myself that that gift of freedom, when abused originally, actually had an effect on the natural world and the created universe. Now, that's another big question. But to say that it leads to be devoted to a God like that, I understand them perfectly if there's no rationale behind it. And I feel, having thought about this for most of my life really, because I feel it's the hardest question, I think there's enough reason to trust God with those ragged edges. And my main reason for doing that is actually the cross. This is God becoming part of suffering. It's not an explanation in the sense of a logical explanation. It's a demonstration. And therefore, let me put it this way. I have sufficient confidence in God to worship him because A, I see he's come near to suffering and has suffered. B, because I believe death is not the end. And C, because I believe there's going to be a final assessment that will put things right. And of course it centrally depends on whether the Christian faith is true or not. If I didn't believe it was true, I'd have no answers.
That's a better answer than you gave during your previous debate. Well done.
Well, I don't remember what answer I gave during the previous debate.
So, John, let's move on. In considering these two sources of evil, this natural evil and this moral evil, I want to sort of turn to another issue that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, and that is the Bible hints in some of the books of the Bible to a larger picture we might be missing if we simply take evil as being either natural evil or moral evil. And I want just to start with maybe considering the book of Job and what it tells us about this. So this is what I've sort of been thinking about, and that is, first of all, the book of Job tells us that Job was a righteous man. So I'm assuming from that he was, to a certain extent, blameless. But it tells us also that Job was caught up in a much bigger theater of war that was going on, occurring, and it was really occurring between these forces of good and evil, between a moral God and between Satan. It seems as the story evolves, God gives permission to Satan in the book to bring about this devastation of Job's family and all his belongings. So here's my question. Are we, like Job, simply caught up as innocent victims in the midst of this supernatural war? And is the supernatural evil a source of evil that's outside of our own moral failure?
Yes and no. In the sense that I wouldn't put it like caught up as innocent victims, as if this was something terrible. But I do think there's a bigger theatre. The very interesting thing is, the moment you begin to talk about a bigger picture, about God and a force of evil that's personified, Satan, the world tends to laugh. I find that very odd, ladies and gentlemen, I must say, because most of my scientific friends believe the whole universe is populated by endless aliens. It's just when the Bible says there might be other powers that they start to laugh. That is totally inconsistent. We know so little about our universe, and the Bible, interestingly, doesn't put all the blame on humanity, but says there was an evil rebellion at a much higher level. And I don't find a difficulty in believing that, even as a scientist, because it seems to me there are various levels of life. There's bacterial life, there's animal life, there's human life. Does it stop there? According to the Bible, no. There is life. There are spirit beings. Now, we're not going to go into that in detail. The important thing is the question that the Bible claims that there's been a rebellion at a higher level than human, and it's affected Earth. The best writer I've ever read that has really captured this is C.S. Lewis in his science fiction trilogy. That we are caught up in a huge battle. But the amazing thing is that God has chosen that human beings should play a very significant part of that battle. And the central claim of Christianity is staggering. It's that God became human. And part of the reason of doing that was to save humanity, but it was also to win that decisive victory against the ultimate supernatural powers of evil. And so, therefore, I see Job, and Job's very interesting because God comforts Job, and he has the problem of moral and natural evil. It's very carefully put at the beginning, because he loses some of his possessions as a result of fire coming down from the sky and so on. Others because the Sabaeans raid. You've got the problem of moral evil and natural evil. And most of the time, God comforts Job by talking to him about the universe. And I used to think that's the oddest thing I've ever read. You know, were you there when I put the stars in the sky? Can you organize the snow and the rain and so on? And then I met a man who was 7 years in solitary confinement in Tibet. And I said to him, some of you will know his name, Jeffrey Bull. I said, Jeffrey, what saved your sanity? He said, a little bird. It came and sat on the sill and the window and the bars. And he said, I looked at that and I thought, there's something perfect in this universe. It's not all evil. And he said, for 7 years when I sat in there, it was that little bird and the odd bits of the Bible I was able to remember that saved my sanity. It was exactly the Job effect. So I think, yes, there's a bigger picture, but we're not, in that sense, innocent victims. The amazing thing is this, to my mind, that we could easily be overwhelmed by superior force and powers. And God, in his mercy to us, when he comes into our world, he doesn't come in blazing light, threatening people and so on. He comes almost incognito so that people can have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine with him and chat to him, so that they can get to know what God is like. Now, if I were to continue this, the examples I would give is a New Testament example that corresponds to Job. And that is the disciple, Peter, who before the crucifixion, Jesus said to him, Satan has desired to have you, that is all the disciples, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith shouldn't fail. And you know, Peter denied the Lord and so on. But the very interesting thing is this. Satan has asked to have you. He's not in control. This is not a yin and yang, a dualistic universe with equal powers of good and evil. Satan's powers are limited. He's asked to have you to do what? Sift you as wheat. But that's a very strange metaphor. Because sifting wheat is to get the good sorted out from the bad. It's not to destroy anything. So, in effect, what God allowed the enemy to do in Peter's heart when he panicked and denied The purpose of that was to make him the man he became after the crucifixion, who stood up and announced the Christian message fearlessly to the world. So that God is in control of that. Now, this is a huge topic, but I think it's worth putting the parallel to see, or at least to begin to see how it works. And Peter wasn't an innocent victim, but there were forces operating on him that were much bigger than him. But God was involved in the situation, making sure that he still retained his authenticity and his capacity to choose. God doesn't overwhelm us or allow us to be overwhelmed so that we lose all sense of autonomy, authority, and the things that make for character through our own choosing and decision making.
Thanks, John. Well, I've got many, many more questions, but I'm afraid we're sort of coming to the end of at least my section of the questions, and we're going to be transitioning through to student questions in a minute. Let me try and look at maybe the last question here. I want to turn our attention now to God's view on justice here on earth, not the final justice, here on earth. And I'm going to ask you a sort of provocative question, and that is, has God changed his mind? And so I'm going to revert back to Old Testament, and we're going to take Psalm 109. And this particular psalm is noted for some of the most frighteningly severe curses in the Bible. Let me just read a couple of them. It says, "Let there be none to extend mercy unto him, neither let there be any to favor his fatherless children." And the psalm goes on to say, "Let his prosperity be cut off, and in the generation following let their name be blotted out." We can also, of course, turn not only to Psalm 109, but so the books of, Exodus and Deuteronomy, where we have God's commandment to genocide in the invasion of Canaan, and the permission of his permission of putting the Israelites into slavery in Egypt. So God seems to have his mind made up in the Old Testament. How do we put the actions of God in the Old Testament together with the God incarnate of the New Testament? A God of love, a God of peace, a God of healing, and turning the other cheek. And so my question for you, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, has God changed his mind about justice here on earth?
Well, now let me try and unpack that a little bit. You quoted Psalm 109. That isn't God speaking. That is the psalmist speaking. Now, when we come to the Bible, there's an interesting thing. Not everything recorded in the Bible is true, is it, or good? We're told a story of David committing adultery, and God later disapproves of it. And I think we've got to open our minds, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, I think, to the idea that in some of the Psalms there is a record of what certain people thought, but it's not necessarily a reflection of the attitude of God. And you can understand somebody who's suffered terribly, people do, as you know, you hear them all the time, wishing all kinds of vengeance on their enemies. So I would give God the benefit of the doubt there and say these are recorded, and I believe they're inspired, but they're not necessarily attitudes that, oh, well, that's the right attitude because it's in that psalm. I think they're there for us to see that here are people who are genuine people, who have a whole range of emotions. Some of them are very good and some of them are very suspect, and we've got to learn to deal with them. The much more weighty issue for me is your second point, because you mentioned the actual point where we know that God steps in. So can I take that point? Because I think it's the more substantive one. It comes up all the time, that you have in Deuteronomy the command to go into Canaan, to Joshua, and wipe everybody out. You see. And people say, but this is ethnic cleansing, this is genocide, and this is God behind it. Now, I take that very seriously, and my response very briefly is this. Number one, this event is described in a book, not an obscure book of the Bible, but a book that defines the very morality with which we criticize it. That is very striking. The laws of humanitarian war, the first ones in history, are in the same book, Deuteronomy. And as Lord Sachs, our former chief rabbi, pointed out, he said they're very humanitarian. Spare the women and children, spare the trees, and so on. Seek peace before you do war. They're all in the very book that describes this event. So the first thing you're faced with is this must be extremely unusual. That's the first point. The second point is that the reason given in Deuteronomy for that invasion of Canaan is moral. It's because of the extreme wickedness, and it involved some of the worst excesses of child sacrifice that the world has ever seen. And in fact, the bigger biblical picture is, as it puts it, that God waited for 400 years, and waited and waited and waited, and he allowed that entry into the land of Canaan to coincide with the zenith of that wickedness, and judged it. The next point is that God told Israel if they behaved the same way, they'd receive the same punishment. So this isn't a question of an arrogant nation coming in to ethnically cleanse. They're told you must deal with that because it's morally evil, but if you compromise with the same thing, you're going to get the same punishment. And that actually happened. So that what it then resolves itself to, and now I'm indebted to the scholars, like Nicholas Wolterstorff here, and is he in Harvard, I think, or Yale, who study this in detail. There was a big conference on this just recently. All this business to kill them all, and it's repeated. And he points out that it's repeated so often that it must be an ancient formulaic. Now, if I said to you, all England came to the funeral of Princess Diana, well, some people were in bed with flu, you know, and but we know what it means, a substantial quantity. And Wolterstorff's conclusion, as one of the world's leading biblical scholars, is that what this means is score a decisive victory over. And the reason it's in one of the most moral books of the Old Testament is that the rules of war contained in that book were not actually broken. Because if you ask yourself the question, were all these cities wiped out? The answer is no, because they all reappear again, populated. So it wasn't carried out in the literalistic sense. And so for all of those reasons, I think we're beginning to get a picture that changes. And also the idea that the God of the Old Testament is an angry God, the God of the New is a God of love. Not so. God is a God of mercy, long-suffering. All of that is from the Old Testament, not from the New. So I think there are ways of approaching that, but they leave a huge question. And the huge question is, and this is what we don't like, we don't like the concept of judgment. We like it even less if human agency is involved, like Joshua to judge a tribe, but we don't like it. People were killed, but as I said before, there are many innocent people will die before the end of our session. So we've got to face then this, and it is really that final question, that question of judgment and justice. And you see, this is a very important part of my Christianity. Dawkins, in that quote, I didn't quote it all for sake of time, he says, the world has no justice. Now, here's the tragedy. I talked to him about this in one of our debates, and he said, we must work for justice in this world. And I said, yes, Richard, we must. But let's be realistic. How privileged we are here. We have some hope if something goes wrong that we'll get justice. But the multi-millions of people in the world will not get justice in this life. And if death is the end, they will never get justice. Now, I take that very seriously indeed. Here we are as human beings that cry for justice. And as Lewis points out, it would be a very strange world in which we got thirsty but there was no such thing as water. In which we felt sexual desire and there was no such thing as sexual satisfaction. That would be a very strange world. And it would be a very strange world if we cry for justice, and justice is a huge concept in our society, and yet we adhere to a philosophy that denies it ultimately. There's no ultimate justice. So in the end, the terrorist who destroys you, your family, and maybe part of your nation, then shoots himself at the end, gets away with it. That seems to me to contradict every basic thing that constitutes us as humans. And what the Bible says is there will be a final judgment. And that's announced as a wonderful thing to be greeted, that God will judge the world, because the person he's going to judge the world through is the same person that suffered on the cross and rose again. And that's where I bring all this together, that I believe, let me put it very provocatively, I believe that if we could see what God has done with people who suffered innocently and so on, we would just be silent and have no more questions. Because if there is a God of love, as I believe there is, who's like Jesus Christ, I believe he will compensate in a way that will leave us all with nothing more to say. But we'll only see that when we've come to see the whole picture.